Morning, everyone. I hope that everyone's had a good morning tea break. We now move on to panel two, which is looking at the economic analysis of migration. It gives me great pleasure to facilitate this panel. It's a very good panel, got a lot of subject matter experts that will be presenting their research to us this morning. But before we go in, I probably just say that my name is Viliame Bovoro. I'm the Assistant Director at the Pacific Fusion Center based in Vanuatu. So you could say I'm from Fiji. I live and work in Vanuatu. I'm funded by the Australian government. My family lives in the US, so I'm a good example of a migrant. Probably an economic migrant, not a climate migrant. But we really do have some good interesting work that will be presented by our panelists this morning. And without further ado, I'll now introduce our first speaker. He will be joining us online. Dr. Michael J. Levin obtained his PhD from anthropological fieldwork, looking at population pressures on scarce resources on European atoll in Micronesia. Most of his professional work involves assisting countries in the Pacific and Africa in processing their census data. He has also coordinated Micronesian migrant surveys in Guam, Saipan, Hawaii, and the US. His topic this morning that he will be presenting to us is on female Micronesian migration to Guam, Hawaii, and the US mainland for better opportunities. The presentation looks at the brief history of Micronesian migration to Guam from the Federal States of Micronesia, the cooper states between the FSM and the US, which allows for visa-free movement, which many FSM citizens have taken advantage of. Without further ado, I'll now throw to Dr. Levin, who's online, and then he will take us through this first session.
Oops. All right. I apologize to everyone. I couldn't come. I just turned 77, and there's a point where you have to give up a little bit. I'm going to talk about somewhat further along the line than the first participants spoke this morning. The FSM migration is ongoing, and it's been ongoing for some period of time. Oops. I can't make it go down. Wait, hold on. I can't make it go down. I tried that. Oh, okay. They've undergone 4 colonial regimes: Spanish, then German, then Japanese, and finally American. Throughout the early period, they had very small populations, especially during the Japanese period, when the Japanese actually kept the population small. There was rapid growth, though, during the American period from the 1950s up into around 2000. The Compact of Free Association was implemented in 1986. This was a treaty between the U.S. and the Federated States of Micronesia, FSM, and also there was one with the Marshall Islands, and there was one later in 1994 with Palau. All of these allow for visa-free entry. So this allows them to come again without any visa, and they can go back and forth, they can work, they can join the military, and they can be students. And so this is something which has been very beneficial because it's alleviated some of the population pressure on very scarce resources, particularly for the atolls in FSM and in the Marshall Islands. Up until about 2000, the population increased, but in subsequent censuses, the population has decreased because of the enormous outflow of migrants. Why did we do the FSM migrant surveys? I'm going to be talking about the last survey, but there have been a whole series of surveys once the compacts were put in place. The compacts required impact reporting. That is, what was the financial and other impact on Guam, CNMI, and the state of Hawaii. And previously, there was $30 million a year to offset the costs of taking care of the migrants. It didn't always work, but they just implemented the third compact, and in that compact, they no longer have to do the surveys. They distribute the funds in a different way. There's negative impact in terms of health, education, crime, and homelessness, but there's positive impact in the fact they're paying for education, they're making incomes, they're doing expenditures, buying stoves and refrigerators and motorcycles and so forth. And there's remittances, both directions, both coming in and going out. The history of the Micronesian migrant surveys, the first one was around 1990. As I said, the implementation was 1986. It took a while for them to start measuring who was moving and how fast they were moving. But the ones that started in 1992 and 93 and 97, 99, 2003, and then 2012 were ones that I coordinated under the Department of Interior, in the U.S. 2008 was done by the U.S. Census Bureau in a completely different way. We were using the snowball method to get all of the Micronesians who had migrated as much as possible. The last one in 2012, though, was a sample. I don't know how to get it. Oh, okay. The Census Bureau does not release microdata. Therefore, we have a lot of trouble getting information about the migration to the U.S. because the groups are still too small to really trigger tables that are published and distributed. So the Office of Insular Affairs funded these early enumerations that I described. The last one, though, was funded by the FSM government in 2012. There's been no funding since then to do any further ones. As of 2012, there were approximately 50,000 migrants total who were in Guam, CNMI, Hawaii, and the U.S. mainland. About half of them had already come to the mainland. You can see that in 1995, there were only about 3,000. In the early years, Guam was the primary destination, CNMI to a much less extent. Then Hawaii picked up, and finally the U.S. mainland is now the biggest recipient of the migrants. And there are quite a few more migrants now than are shown here. Can't get this thing to go. Oh, okay. So this was, I just wanted to show you that in 2008, the Census Bureau did an enumeration and they came up with this pyramid, the pyramid indicating that there were many people who were there for education and for early employment and entry level for the most part. But the next time that we did it in 2012, I still can't make it. This is what it actually looked like on Guam in 2012. By 2012, the early migration had already smoothed out. They were in the second and even third generation. So when we did our survey, there were people who had never been to Micronesia, in fact, who were Micronesian and were counted in the surveys because of the fact that their parents were. This shows you the Micronesians inside and outside. And you can see here that by this time in 2012, about a third of the total Micronesian population had already left Micronesia. The outside ones are the Micronesia, within Micronesia, within FSM, and the interior ones are the migrants. And you can see that there still was fairly high fertility among the resident population, but not in the sending populations. And this compares the U.S. population pyramid with the FAS pyramid at the time. This is for the whole census, the whole Micronesian population. Oh, okay. So this shows you the 50,000 people split up. I've been doing a series of studies of female migration. Female is changing roles of females over time. And in order to do that, I've had to go back to early censuses because in the early years, the censuses, both Census Bureau and other places, did not distinguish by sex in most of their tables because the females were not participating either in education or employment. Now they are. So in order to get the trend lines, we have to go back. But this was at the end, as of 2012. You can see that the numbers of migrants are about the same. For U.S. mainland, there were about 2,000 more females than males. Part of this has to do with the fact that males were joining the military, and so the wives and children were there, but the males were not. This shows citizenship. Over time, you would expect more and more of the migrants to become U.S. citizens, and this is what's happening. In CNMI, it was where the original trust territory was. This was after the World War II, when the U.S. set up a government. Many people moved there, they married, and they had their own children, and so there are quite a few U.S. citizens. But if you look at Hawaii and the mainland, you see that for the most part, they still were FSM citizens, both males and females. Okay, so most of them came either to work, the males especially, but females as well. But between the two, it was about 60% of the migrants were either coming for employment or as a family member, and then about a quarter of them were coming for education. Unfortunately, the Census Bureau did release data for 2020, but they didn't do it by gender. So I don't have very much information yet from that census. But we do have this because only females produce fertility. So on Guam in 2020, the average woman had 2 children. And you can see that for the various groups from Micronesia, they all had more than 2 children, except the Yapese, but they did not have as many as 3, which indicates that as they left, they took into account the fact that they were going to leave, and they did not have as many children as the people in the sending populations. A little bit on education of the migrants. The percentage of high school graduates within FSM, less than half of the population in 2010 census were high school graduates. But you can see that for all of the sending groups, there was more. And for the U.S. mainland, it was about 3 out of every 4, both for males and females. Although, except for the mainland, the percentage of males with high school educations was higher than females. This is college graduates. Now, what happened was that when Micronesians got college degrees, there were always positions for them. That's changed recently, but the reason that the percentage is higher than for some of the migrants, for example, for Guam, is partly because they could come back, and partly because on Guam, especially, everyone is going. I mean, it's a very short trip from Chuuk to Guam. And so many people who are going into entry level, working at McDonald's and that kind of thing are going, and very few of them have higher level degrees. But you can see for the U.S. mainland that it's different. Especially males at 6% and females at 5%. Again, in general, the males had higher, but the females are catching up. Speaking English at home, obviously the longer that they live in the receiving populations, the more likely they are to speak English at home. In CNMI, because the migration has been so long, they have the largest percentages of people, both males and females, with females a little bit more speaking English. But the numbers are still small. Only 1 out of every 4 of the migrants speaks English at home. And this is where we're seeing the big change for females, both within Micronesia and outside. This is for the University of Guam in 2019 when they did their census there. 57% of all of the students were female at UOG. And the same percentage were from FAS, from FSM Marshalls and Palau. But you can see that for Coast Ryans, it was 7 out of every 10. It was 3 out of 5 for Palauans. So that except for Marshallese and Yappies, in every case, females are more likely than males to be students at UOG in 2019. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the labor force that's happening now. This shows early migrants from 1992 to 2001. They used to take surveys every quarter on Guam. That's no longer the case, but they do take them on occasion. And of course, the numbers are much higher. But this shows you that the numbers of males and females in the labor force were about the same in these early years from 1992 to 2001, and that's continued. This is the percentage working for pay in the week prior to the survey. And so about 58% of the males and 52% of the females were working for pay in the week before the survey took place. And you can also see that for the U.S. mainland, it was 72% for the males, 54% for the females. Still, this is higher than what was going on in Micronesia at that time. This is the average hourly wage. People making, this was for the total of all the migrants, $11 an hour for males and about $10 an hour for females. This is very low. And most of the people are in poverty because they don't make very high livings. And even with many of them living together, which is what they often do when they're first starting out, they have trouble making it, and there's large numbers in poverty. The U.S. mainland had, of course, the highest rates, and they were in the best shape. For year-round full-time workers in 2011, that was the full year before the survey, about 42% of the males and 36% of the females were working full-time year-round. As you can see, half of the males in the U.S. mainland were in this category, and about 44% of the females. That was the highest percentage, and it was virtually necessary because there's very little assistance in terms of welfare and others that they get ready access to. They're entitled, but they don't always get into it for quite a while. And the percent working in the private sector, as you would expect with, and I'm sure this is the case for migrants to Australia and New Zealand as well, it takes a while before people start moving into the public sector. So almost everybody was working in the private sector, with the exception of CNMI, where the migration was so long ago, the early migration, that about even half of the females were working in the public sector by then, and a third of the males. This is on Guam, comparing the total population with the FSM population or FAS population. And you can see that, again, the private sector was predominant for the migrants, very little public sector compared to Guam population as a whole, where there were quite a few more, obviously, working in the public sector. So the household income across female-headed households made less. Part of the reason they made less money was because the husband wasn't there. There was a female-headed household with no husband present, but otherwise, even so, the females households made less money. And you can see in the U.S. mainland, it's $10,000 a year less. And in general, it's about $10,000 difference. It's closer in CNMI and Guam. And then the percent in poverty. It's the last one. Families with female householders and no spouse present, you can see that 3 out of every 5 of those households were in poverty, compared to about a third of all of the households on Guam. In general, the Micronesian households as you can see, were mostly in poverty, or half of them were in poverty, and compared to about 17% for the total population. So this gives you a little overview of what's happening among the migrants. Yeah, okay. That seems to be, oh, all right. So this is where they're coming from. This is a kind of island that many of the migrants come from. This is where I did my field work. Okay, that's it. I don't know exactly how to get out of that. So can you please take me out?
I was just going to abuse the mic really briefly at the start, just to take advantage of this privilege of being in front of everyone. And since this is a session on economic analysis, who in the room identifies as an economist? How many we got here? Not that many, you're a minority, but welcome. I truly am a true believer in our discipline. I do love it. For a lot of reasons, for many reasons, too many to mention, but one of them is like when we go back to our 101, the first things that we learn in our first classes is concepts of social welfare, broad social welfare. It's not just about money, it's about maximizing social welfare. What's nice about that is it's sort of termed in terms of a benevolent social planner. And when you think about policy and when we think about our analysis, it's nice because you're not just talking about dollars and cents. And it forces you to think about who you're defining, whose welfare you're trying to maximize as well. And so we take this in to our analyses and our frameworks, and reflecting on some of the discussions this morning, I feel like this would benefit from a lot more discussions with economists at times. So I do welcome collaboration on that front. And the other nice thing about when you're maximizing social welfare, it's inclusive of benefits and costs. Sometimes people like talking about net benefits, but social welfare is a much broader concept than that in terms of analysis and the way that we approach our frameworks. I just wanted to get that out of my system after this morning. But I'm not actually talking about any economics today. This is just pure data and some stories, some anecdotes actually. The title for today's talk is The Financial Lives of Pacific Migrants. It's with my fantastic colleague Estelle, who has been leading the data analysis on, doing a fantastic job, and she's going to share with you the most interesting stuff at the end. But I'll talk a little bit about how the project started. So the broad motivation for it is that, on Zoom here, that there's been remittances are a huge topic amongst economists and other people, and it's usually what people want to talk about when it comes to announceables around labour mobility and development stuff. And there's been lots of effort devoted to promoting them, studying them, trying to reduce their costs and things like that. But we really don't know all that much about the actual financial lives of the migrant workers and their households back home, and in particular, how they intertwine, how the transnational household really works in terms of decision making, and what's going on in terms of the transactions and those type of things. And this made us think that in collaboration, this is joint with some colleagues at New York University, this tool called Household Financial Diaries, which has now been completed in more than a dozen countries. They've been really helpful for understanding the real barriers to household financial security for low-income households in many contexts. The first book on this was Portfolios of the Poor, which many people might have recognized, and it's now been replicated in a lot of different contexts. So we partnered with sort of the pioneers of this approach for this project. And what it involves is collecting really high-frequency, detailed financial information from people to really try and understand the choices that they're making, the behaviors and the interactions, and hopefully shine some light on answers to policy problems. But in a way, it's much more generative. It doesn't really generate the answers. It really highlights the puzzles and the questions of what we should be thinking about next. And today, we're going to shine a little bit of new light on some of the financial lives of migrants, hopefully give you something to take away and think about. And this is with new data that we've got from the remittance diaries. I've gone with a broad general interest journal picture with the Pacific Migrants title, but it's actually much more precise than that. It's just in Fiji. And if we backdate to when we started the project, it was with then PLS workers, but now long stay palm workers in Australia. Compared to what I would normally do as an economist, where I'd be very worried about representativeness and sample sizes, like to the Pacific Labour Mobility Survey, this is a much smaller N and much larger T data. So long time series, smaller N, much more like a case study, except rather than just going and doing a focus group with them one time, we've done it every single week for a year. So you get to know them, you build the trust, you get much more reliable information and stories. And so it's with a small group of these workers and their households. And so everyone that we are getting data from here is sort of mapped to their remittance receiver back home. Household's not the right term because it might be the parent, might be the partner, It's a remittance receiver. They're spread across regional Australia reasonably well. Gender and when I say key sectors, they're all in aged care or me, which was a purposeful decision on our part. So there's weekly data collection for at least 6 months. Some of them go up to a year, and we did 3 quite general thematic qualitative surveys as well. One on decision making, one sort of as a postdoc to find out what their experience was like engaging in the study, what they learned, those type of questions, and the other one was on migration itself, and migration decisions and intentions and aspirations and so forth. And it's a collaboration between us, NYU, FAI, LIFT, and a few others. So the diaries methodology, it's a tricky project for me because I work, when I write papers, it's usually in a much more linear fashion. I forgot to set the timer. Can you tell me when I get to 10 minutes, please? Oh, okay, fine. So I'm not allowed to steal the mic from Excel. So compared to what I would normally do, it's quite tricky because even though it is structured in a way, when the data comes back, it's a massive corpus and it is much more unstructured. So you really need to think how to look at it. But some of the strengths and benefits of it is rather than going out there and testing a hypothesis, which is what I would normally do as a researcher, I pride myself on being a very serious social scientist. It's more about theory generation and sort of trying to explore theories and patterns. It's an inductive rather than deductive exercise and trying to piece together different bits of the parts. And as we sort of get feedback over time, we didn't have all the modules designed at the start. The modules and the questions were sort of iterated over time based on fieldwork, based on how things were going to figure out what was the emerging themes and what we wanted to unpack. And if you want to learn about the method in a bit more detail, this is a companion project to the small firm diaries, which we also did in Fiji and 7 other countries around the world. And there's a nice methodological note online that Google will take you to. In terms of field implementation, so we did the design, scope, and data collection instruments obviously first. We gratefully received the complete worker listing from PLF, which allowed us to formulate the sample quite purposefully. And then we restricted that by sector, location, and gender to get a nice group that would hopefully tell us some interesting stories. Recruited and trained the team, and then began participant recruitment and the intake surveys over time. So the household data collection was all done face-to-face, and then the worker data collection was done face-to-face in England by a team in Fiji calling people in Australia. Minimum of 25 weeks of data collected for all. It was an intensive process, right? Like when you recruit someone to do a survey, getting them to sit down for half an hour or an hour is a big deal, let alone saying, I'm going to come back and see you every single week, Charlie, until the end of the year, and then hopefully that. But everyone stuck with us for the whole project, and there was really good rapport at the end. And we did an end of service study at the end, and there was an awful lot of cleaning and quality checks that had to go into it. But thankfully, the team at NYU had done this many times, and so made this very easy for us. So I'll talk a little bit about life in Australia. So this is what income looks like, and the takeaway from this one is just that, at least amongst the long-stay farm workers, it's a big gender gap. Women tend to earn a fair bit more than men in our relatively small and unrepresentative sample. Here, if we were to plot all the earnings. So, and this is post-tax, but inclusive of deductions, in order to get to income. So yeah, so here you're at about, I should have wrote down the number, but we're at about, I guess, 1,800 there, and 2,200 for females, and that's predominantly reflecting the sector differences, which comes through right here, right? So if you look at the spread of people by male and female across genders, of course, most of the men are working in meat. We all already knew that in the room. Women are more spread across sectors, but they also dominate aged care and hospital and tourism. And so these ones here are largely sector differences in income, which we already knew from the PLMS, really, right? And then if we split that up a bit more and look at the income, particularly by industry, just to make that a bit clearer, here you've got aged care sort of way out. So this is fortnightly income, post-tax, for the whole sample by industry of group. And so around 2,500 is about the median for female workers in the long stay farm scheme in the aged care sector, which is not too bad. But there's a huge difference, right? Look at that spread, and each of those ones is a pretty multimodal bell curve of sorts. So down here, if we're looking at hospitality and tourism, much lower, and meat and agriculture are actually overlapping each other reasonably closely. But one nice thing about this data set is, as you would expect, and as with all data sets, it's putting together all of the individual stories together to try to tell a much bigger picture. So here we can delve into, 6 examples of workers from the aged care sector. And what you see, it's not straightforward. It's not the same every week. When we go and do our normal surveys and ask how much did you earn last week, you're just getting that snapshot from that one piece in time. And of course, that if you assume that week's random and everyone's picked at random, then it washes out and you still get a decent number. But what we get from this data set is you really do get to see the ebbs and the flows. And so you can take a stock take at the level and see that, well, income is still up around that level that we were describing before. Well, there's a few ebbs and troughs. And because every transaction in our data set is labeled, we know exactly what that cost was there or what that one was for. And so it really does allow you to sort of understand how people are sort of coping and what they're doing. But the main point from this graph, I guess, was that you do notice the gap, right? So income here is generally quite far above expenses. And that means that what's left in here, these are your savings. And then this bottom bit, so expenses, remittances are recorded as an expense. So that's not separate. You wouldn't add that on top of there. That's part of that area down there in the bottom. But yeah, that shows a pretty big net saving, but also shows lots of ups and downs, right? It's not necessarily constant. And these are the workers where you would expect it to be more constant because it's a full-time contract with very similar hours every week. So if we put the whole sample together, again, not bad. I'm going to speed up anyway to test. You know, that Estelle is more interesting. But that's not cool. So if we put all the data together, then you see the sort of similar level over time, right? I'm going to skip a little bit faster because I promised at the start I wouldn't get too much from Excel. The expenses, as you would expect, are much noisier than the income, like all of our expenses are. We have different discretionary habits depending on how we're feeling and so forth. And the biggest one is almost always sort of what you would classify as your cost of living basics, right? Like your rent, food, and so forth. Discretionary is way below that. And interestingly, people are sending as much back into remittances as they're spending on their basic cost of living stuff here. Like roughly overlapping there, which that jumped out to us as kind of interesting, despite those ebbs and flows. And then if we were to back out the net savings for 6 months from someone here, the median of that is this line here amongst the sample that you group here. And those 2 down the bottom of the negatives are actually interesting. That was a hospitalization case where they reported the costs as within there, but then not the insurance paying it out as income. So where do you get that network from? And this was someone that was sort of living online and had access to good credit and was spending basically as much as they earned, which some of us do. I'm looking at myself here. And so yeah, I'll skip through this one. So in life in Fiji, I can tell these points basically one per slide. So I do want to hand it to Estelle. The story here, so this is non-work income, classifying income in Fiji based on its source. Non-work income versus business income versus employment versus agriculture amongst the receiving households. It's all a remittance story. It's all non-work income coming from remittances. There isn't another source of income for these households. And if it is, it's very, very small. And then when you look at the finances per week in terms of income and expenses and remittances that are coming in, it's characterized by a lot more volatility, right? And again, income and remittances, look at how they overlap each other overall. And there is, fortunately, a nice gap between expenses and income here. But one sort of mistake in hindsight that I regret with this project is that we didn't go and collect the same data from non-participant households to try and compare whether this looks smoother and so forth and how it's going, which would have been really nice to be able to tell. Again, if we break it down, basics are the biggest one, discretionary and then other, and sorry.
Yeah.
No, you got time.
So as Ryan has mentioned, we've looked at a bit of life in Australia for the migrants who come here, and then life in Fiji. And now we can think about life apart but together, because the sample was migrants who had moved here and their families or households back in Fiji. And so with the surveys that ask questions about decision-making and deeper things, there were some interesting findings, but I'm just going to show one, which was about involvement in household financial decisions, because although migrants are geographically apart from their families, they are still connected, not the least by sending remittances. We saw what a priority remittances are to them in the spending categories. And so these images here show for the questions of involvement in household financial decisions that both migrants and receivers report since the migrants leaving being much more involved. The highest share on the far right-hand side say they were much more involved in the decisions once the migrant had gone. It's not like one side is just getting more involved and the other side is stepping out. I've left, I'm not involved anymore. No, they're actually remaining involved, which makes sense because they're also sending money home. But then they also ask, do you want to become even more involved? And again, what's interesting is both the Fijian households and those in Australia are saying they want to be more involved. So this is something interesting that everybody's saying we want to be involved in these household financial decisions. It's a bit of a puzzle that's worth looking at. Like Ryan said, this data gives us questions to look into. And in the report that's forthcoming on this data, we can look into more elements of control that the migrants are, a lot of them are reporting that they're checking on what the remittances are being spent on. A lot of them are reporting we want more saving, less spending, and all sorts of those sorts of opinions and feelings that we can understand. But again, what these graphs show is not everyone is saying that they're much more involved. There are those who are saying it's about the same or I'm less involved since I've left. So there is variation and it's useful to see those stories. And talking about stories, case studies are powerful things that we can get from this type of data. Like Ryan said, we can actually tag anecdotes that are recorded with the transactions to understand more about lives and stories. Yeah, this is a fortnightly finances for a female in the aged care sector here in Australia. We can see that she sent remittances directly to a contractor for work on a new home. She flew back to Fiji. You can see her expenses go up around the 15th fortnight. And then her salary was reduced for the time she was back in Fiji. And then we can see her family, an older woman who's the receiver tagged with this migrant, and she reports around Christmas time, extra remittances. You can see the little spike. Something happens in the family or community, money is sent for a death. And like Ryan said, most of the time we're seeing that remittances are the main income, but we can get to see the divergences from the norm with some income from a land lease. And then just one more case study I'll show you is for a male in the meat sector. He's also sending money home for a house extension, religious expenses, for his family, household and school expenses. And this again maps on to the family. His spouse in Fiji records receiving those extra remittances for the house and the asset, the housing materials, the religious remittances. And so these are powerful stories, and hopefully we can keep working for improvements to the lives and stories, the financial lives and stories of individuals and communities in the Pacific. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan and Estelle, for that. I think that's a really a great study to have, where it really brings, I guess, experiences. A lot of time we just talk about data, but I think looking at that study really brings home some of the real experiences that our labor mobility participants, together with feeding households, back what they go through on a daily basis. So it's a really good study. Thank you. Just to maybe what we still have Michael online, if you can bring him back up, maybe we'll open up for Q&A and comments on these first two presentations for 15 minutes. Maybe if Pin can put the time on 15 minutes, if we can have Q&A for Ryan and Estelle's presentation, as well as for Michael's presentation. Michael, if you're still online. And then we can take the two presentations after this Q&A.
Thanks to both presenters for the presentations. They were really interesting. And yeah, welcome to all the economists, long-time social scientists here. So let's fight. No, it's not. I was just going to ask, you guys were talking about the concept of social welfare and economic analysis. And this is something that I'm quite interested in the context of my own research and policy and balancing the quantitative and qualitative aspects of these kinds of things. So I was just wondering if you could tell me more about how the economic discipline is taking into account non-economic indicators of social welfare on things like resilience, social welfare, and loss and damage, for example.
That's not about the presentation. I set myself a trap at the start. That's a good question. Climate economists do an awful lot of that. And there's all kinds of different tools that we do use. But if you just think about choice methodology, people will use, we don't often like believing what people say. Instead, we'd much rather focus on what they do. Revealed versus actual stated preferences. Tools like this that allow you to try and impute what the actual real beliefs and values that people hold are, rather than just going and asking them to try and put a number on it. But that's just one example. And so yeah, like the framework, I mean, I can't summarize for you what an undergrad, let alone a graduate training in economics looks like, and all the theories that we do, because a lot of it is modeling based. A lot of it is about developing a sort of simple and small and tractable framework that allows you to sort of frame these things and focus in on sort of sufficient indicators that can capture what we're talking about there. So yeah, I can't summarize it for you quickly. Okay. Please come and study economics at the Crawford School. We've got a fantastic Master of International and Development Economics program where you will get all of these tools within your first 2 semesters.
I was just going to respond quickly as well. Definitely, it's not possible to do a defense of a field of study or necessary because all the different fields are needed. But maybe similar to what Ryan was saying, when you're looking at policy and the tool of RCTs, which is certainly not the only thing in economics, but for development economics to say, what are the outcomes that actually get achieved for individuals? And that's when it can be more than just numbers, but outcomes of well-being in people's lives.
My name is Gemma Jackson. I'm a student looking at labour mobility. Really fascinating presentations, thank you. And I hope my question isn't unfair. I really liked the information you gave around the financial sort of income discrepancies between men and women and sort of relating that to sector. Do you know at all if that sort of factors into future labour mobility's workers' choices of sector or employer or anything like that?
Well, I think I would probably question the premise at which you came at that with. These are employer-sponsored schemes, right? They're demand-driven. People don't necessarily get to have too much choice in what they do. You need to get accepted and chosen by an employer in the first place. And the schemes won't exist and won't survive without employer demand. So I'm sure that some will be more popular, and people absolutely do vote with their feet to try and go to maximise where their earnings are to take back home. But when it does come to things like aged care, well, I mean, MAPE will have a pretty low barrier to entry. Aged care doesn't. You need to have the qualifications to get into aged care to earn there's higher incomes there. And I would expect, based on like all the other literature on brain gain stuff, that yes, the opportunities do send incentives to people in the labour market to invest in those skills if they think it's going to get them a placement abroad. Even if that probability of getting that placement is pretty low, people will still try and go and get that with the hope of moving. That's what all the other literature and econ suggests to us on this. So I think, yes, it certainly affects decisions. Most things get factored into decisions. How important it is in this particular context, I don't think we have clear answers to yet, but I don't think people are able to choose. Plus, they don't have that much control over where they choose to be able to go and work because they have to get selected, right? The selection comes on the other side. They can apply, but we know there's huge backlogs in the pools, in the LSEs and stuff, with people actually getting through. Sorry, I have a good
Sorry, just before we, I think there's a question online. We could just go online and then we can have our colleague from at the back. Sorry, I think there's a.
Okay, so Cassandra Russell is online from DFAT. She says. Cassandra Russell from DFAT says, thank you for the excellent presentations. She has two questions. The question for Michael is, the poverty stats that Michael presented are sobering. How does the FAS poverty stats compare with the poverty stats for migrants from other regions?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Poverty in the U.S. is actually straightforward because the U.S. collects poverty statistics continuously. Unlike in the rest of the Pacific, most of the time you have to get information on poverty from a wealth index or some other method besides straight income. But the U.S. does income, and so you get a U.S. poverty rate. That rate usually doesn't work very well in the Pacific territories or the previous ones because there's subsistence, there are other kinds of things that are going on. Nonetheless, the answer to your question is most of the immigrants go through the same pattern where they come and they tend to start quite poor, and then as they become more and more part of the American stream, then they go out of poverty, most of them. But you could see in that slide that not everyone. And this is Guam. And what's happening is many Chukis who have very little education and very few labor type skills come, and it takes a while for them to get in. I see very often cases where there are 4 or 5 young guys coming and they live together and they all work in McDonald's. So even the total of their income doesn't come up to above poverty. So that's the kind of thing. But it's also true of other groups besides the freely associated states. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Can I have the mic? Would you like to ask a question?
Oh, just one more part.
Sorry, my apologies.
Cassandra from DFAT had a second question for Ryan. Is there a comparison between what Fijian workers are emitting versus earnings of workers doing the same job in their home country?
There will be in the second wave, the Pacific Labour Mobility Survey, so stay tuned. Not in this data set because we don't collect detailed employment data and we don't have their pre-departure earnings, but we do collect that in other data sets.
Yeah, no.
Yes, a house.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to ask Michael if you can hear me. Thank you very much for participating. You know, we don't hear enough of that compact state experience, but just want to take you back to your first slide. I think you had education listed as both a positive and a negative of the migration experience. So if you could explain that. And then on remittances, you know, it's often said that the migrants, say from FSM, don't send remittances back, but rather save and then help bring others out to the US. Is that true, or what is the situation with remittances? Thank you.
I'll answer the second question first because I've written on that. It's definitely true that that's the case. Where you would normally find remittances, you're finding instead saving money to bring the next generation out. And it's really quite specific, the order of the relatives who are lined up to come out. They come, then they bring their parents, then they bring their nieces and nephews and so forth. And this is being shown in the numbers as well. The other one, can you remind me again what the other question was?
I think on one of your very first slides, you had education as both a benefit and or a positive and a negative.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's what I meant there was that they come they tend to be undereducated. And in fact, in many of the schools in FSM, the teaching is in the vernacular instead of English. So many of them come without any skills or very few language skills. Most of them are quite enthusiastic and they try to learn and so forth. So the issue is that there are resources that Guam and Hawaii, CMI have to put into working with they usually bring in native speakers into the classrooms to help them get through the transition but there's a cost involved. But once they're in, then there's a tendency to start in entry-level jobs, but then move up. The people who migrate are migrating for many of the same reasons that people everywhere in the world are migrating, which is they want a better life, so they do what's necessary to get it. So it's both a positive and a negative.
Thank you. We have, I think we have Toan on the line at the moment. I think he's experiencing some difficulties in public, so we'll probably get him to jump in while we still have him.
Hi everyone, I'm Toan Nguyen. I'm a research fellow at the Development Policy Center at ANU and a visiting economics lecturer at the University of Papua New Guinea. So I'm currently based in Papua New Guinea to teach the course in economics. And today I will present my research about the socio-economic status of the Pacific diaspora in Australia. This research primarily uses two sources of data. The first is the census, and the second is the census linked with the permanent resident visas provided by the Home Affairs. And these data sets are provided by the ABS through their platform named Table Builder. My presentation has 4 parts. In the first part, I will provide an overview of the numbers of Pacific migrants in Australia. And in the second part, I will discuss about the characteristics of the Pacific diaspora population. In the third part, I will present the data on the settlement location of the Pacific migrants. And then I will look at the labor market outcomes of the Pacific immigrants in Australia. In the first part, the numbers of Pacific migrants in Australia. This figure shows the numbers of people in Australia with a Pacific heritage, including the second generation migrants and an estimate of those of Indo-Fijian descent. As shown in the figures, in 2006, there was approximately 180,000 people of the Pacific heritage in Australia, representing 0.9% of the total Australian population. In 2021, this number nearly doubled to 337,000 people, making up 1.3% of the population. So what this figure tells us? This figure tells us that although the Pacific heritage communities in Australia is still relatively small, it is growing rapidly. Unlike the first graph, this figure shows the numbers of first-generation migrants born in the Pacific who are currently living in Australia. These individuals are divided into 2 groups: those with the Pacific ancestries and those without the Pacific ancestries. The blue bars represent those without the Pacific ancestries, and it makes up a significant proportion of the first-generation migrants, especially for countries like Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and Solomon Islands, where they account for 69%, 64%, and 43% respectively. These individuals are the children of the expats with the ancestries from countries like Australia, England, and they are the individuals who the Chinese ancestries. Here's after we use the term Pacific diaspora to refer to those born in the Pacific with the Pacific or Indo-Fijian ancestries. We focus on this subgroup as it better reflects the Pacific communities and its cultures. Overall, around 67% of the Pacific diaspora have a Australian citizenship. However, the rate of citizenship varies, as shown in this table, it varies across the countries. For example, among the top 6 Pacific diaspora communities in Australia, the majorities of Fijians and Timor-Leste diaspora have obtained the Australian citizenship. So you see here, Fijian diaspora, about 76.3% of them have an Australian citizenship. Meanwhile, for Timor-Leste, it's about 79.5%. In contrast, only 46.2% of the Papua New Guinean diaspora in Australia have acquired Australian citizenship. And the figures even lower for Tongan diaspora at just only 42.2%. And for Samoans, it's about just 36%. In the later parts, when we look at the labor market's outcome, we expect that those who have an Australian citizenship are the ones who stay longer in Australia. So probably they are likely to be doing better in terms of education and labor markets outcomes. We have a look at the numbers of Pacific migrants in Australia. And in this section, we move to the characteristics of the Pacific diaspora population. On the left-hand side of the A6 pyramid, that illustrates the distribution of the Pacific diaspora population by age group and gender. The chart shows that the Pacific community is aging, with females making up 51.5% of the total population, and males account for 48.5% of the population. Is it a bit unusual for a diaspora community in Australia to be aging? Because many studies show that the foreign-born population is younger than the Australian-born population. More rigorous research are needed to explain for this issue, but one of the conjecture is that many of the Pacific diaspora in Australia, they went to Australia via the New Zealand pathway. They earned the citizenship of New Zealand before they moved to Australia. That takes a longer time for them, and so they're a bit older. So another observation in this table is that in the younger age group, there are more males than females. But in the older age groups, females outnumber males. Perhaps the women, they have a healthier lifestyle and allowing them to live longer. Regarding to the education, the dark green bars illustrate the educational distributions of the Pacific diaspora with the Australian citizenship. As shows in this chart, over a quarter of these individuals hold a bachelor degrees or higher. These educational levels are similar to those of Australian-born population. Meanwhile, the Pacific, without the Australian citizenship, in the orange bars, have a slightly lower education level compared to the Australian-born population, which is quite reasonable. Another aspect that we want to explore is the settlement locations of the Pacific diaspora. This chart reviews the majorities of the Pacific diaspora resides in Greater Sydney, and Greater Brisbane, with the population in Brisbane even surpassing those in Melbourne. And 90% of the Pacific diaspora with the Australian citizenship are now living in Greater Sydney, Greater Brisbane, or Greater Melbourne. These levels of the urbanization, these levels of the urban concentration is higher than that of the foreign-born, the average of the foreign-born, and higher than that of the Australian-born population. So we know so far that the Pacific diaspora, they live in the city, they have a quite equivalent levels of education compared to those of Australian-born population. They are a bit aging community. So how's about their labor market outcomes? This section we look at two key indicators of the labor market outcomes of the Pacific immigrants. The first is the employment status. So the bar displays the employment status across the four groups. The Pacific diaspora, Pacific diaspora with the citizenship, the Pacific migrants with the skilled permanent residency, the Pacific migrants with the family permanent residency, and the Australian-born population. Someone may ask, why are we focusing on the Pacific with a permanent residency here? This is because the temporary migrants may include tourists and students. So we're just focusing on the permanent resident to ensure that we are comparing more compatible groups. Among these groups, the Pacific migrants with the skilled permanent residency have the lowest rates of unemployment and labor force non-participation. So as you can see in this bar charts, the Pacific migrants with the skilled permanent residency visa have the lowest rates of unemployment and labor force non-participation. In contrast, the Pacific diaspora with the Australian citizenship have a slightly higher rate of unemployment and labor force non-participation compared to the Australian-born population. In terms of the weekly incomes, the dark blue bar here represent the distribution of the Pacific diaspora, which is more evenly spread compared to the green bar showing the Australian-born population. And the income distribution for the Pacific diaspora with the Australian citizenship is more concentrated in the middle income bracket. So they are less appears in the top, but they are also less appear in the bottom. The Pacific migrants with the skilled permanent residency, the data in the gray here, have the higher incomes compared to the Australian-born population. For example, if we look at the income bracket from $2,000 to $2,999 per week, 13.5% of the Pacific diaspora with the skilled permanent residencies have the income in this bracket, compared to just only over 8% of the Australia-born population. Meanwhile, the Pacific migrants with the family permanent residency visa, the data in the orange here, have the highest rate of zero income. But they are also, the distribution is also more concentrated in the middle brackets compared to the Australian-born population. So far, we have uncovered the socio-economic status of the Pacific diaspora. To summarize, I'd like to have 6 key points to take away from the presentation. First, the Pacific diaspora community in Australia is relatively small, but it is growing rapidly. And amongst those born in the Pacific and now living in Australia, many do not have the Pacific ancestries. The community is aging and has a higher proportion of females compared to males. And those with the Australian citizenship within the Pacific diaspora have a similar levels of education to the Australian-born population. And the majorities of the Pacific diaspora communities tend to settle in the urban centers, with 2/3 residing in Greater Sydney and Greater Brisbane. They have a slightly higher rate of unemployment and non-participation in the labor forces compared to the Australian-born population. However, their weekly incomes is more evenly distributed than that of the Australian-born population. Thank you so much for attending my presentation. This research is the first part of my series that focus on the assimilation of the Pacific diaspora in Australia. And I'm currently looking more detailed at the country levels and the visa type, including the temporary visas. And also I'm exploring the social economic status and the factors that influence the assimilation of this community. For example, how the settlement location affects the assimilation of the Pacific diaspora in Australia using the administrative data.
Thank you very much, Toan, for your presentation. We'll now have our final panelist, Sharon. Sharon is a research officer at the Development Policy Center. She graduated with a Master's in International and Development Economics from the ANU, and her research interests include economic development in the Pacific, and she's recently joined the DevPol Pacific Migration Team. And Sharon will present to us on Fiji's emigration boom.
Hello everyone, I'm Sharon, and thank you, Levin, for the introduction. And it seems that the audience are pretty familiar with this topic from this morning's talks. But then we're gonna get into some numbers on this huge issue of Fiji's immigration boom. So this research is inspired by an ANZ study. That study reviews there is a recent surge in Fiji's immigration, and they concluded that the immigration is likely to be temporary because of the tightening immigration policies in Australia and New Zealand. However, after talking to a few Fijian colleagues and students, it seems that there is a strong and persistent desire among the Fijians to immigrate in the future. And I hope Viliame agreed to that. So Stephen and I decided to look into this topic and seeing what is the factors driving the Fiji's immigration boom, and then reassess whether this immigration boom is a temporary spike or it's gonna continue into the future. So let's start by looking at numbers of the net departures of Fijians, which is the number of people leaving, the number of Fijian residents leaving the country minus the people who are arriving in the country. And then we can see that using the Fiji Bureau of Statistics, there has been a long trend of Fijian leaving the country. And it's pretty important to point out that there is a recent increase, and that actually starts before COVID-19. The number of Fijian net departures doubled from over 10,000 in 2017 to over 25,000 in 2018. And then after a short pause during the COVID-19, the pace of high migration resumed, and it goes up to 42,000 in 2022, and in 2023 it is another 46,000. There's definitely data issue, but that it kind of paints a picture of how severe the problem of immigration is for Fijians. And because of the tightening policies in Australia and New Zealand, it is pretty important to look at the more recent data, and it shows from January to July in 2024, a total of 21,000 Fijians has left the country. That is less than half of the 2023 level. But if we annualize the 2024 data based on the monthly data patterns from 2023, it actually goes up to 47,000. So at least for this moment, the net departures continue for Fijians in 2024. So the annual departures of over 40,000 is very, very high for Fijians. It is almost like 5% of its population. So the big question is definitely whether this will continue or it is just temporary, that we don't need to worry too much about. So in order to answer this question, we need to understand what is driving this immigration, this high immigration level, whether it is the permanent migrants or it is the temporary migrants. And if it is the temporary migrants, we will see more Fijians leaving the countries on a temporary basis in the future. That makes the migration rate high, just to keep it high. And whether the existing temporary migrants overseas will stay longer, so that we see an increase in the stock of temporary migrants, or alternatively, will those migrants go back in the future? Many of them might choose to stay in Australia permanently, and will drive up the number of permanent migrants in future. So this research framework pretty much guided our following analysis, but then we're gonna see a lot of graphs, and it's just not very intuitive. First, let's start by looking at the Fijian diaspora worldwide over the years, and this one uses the UN data. And we can see that there is a steady increase in the stock number of Fijian immigrants in various countries. And in 2020, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States are the top 3 destinations for Fijian immigrants. And together they account for over 80% of the total Fijian diaspora worldwide. Because of this high concentration, we're going to focus on these 3 countries. For the permanent immigration, this shows the number of Fijians that are granted permanent residencies in Australia, New Zealand, and United States. We can see basically for Australia and New Zealand, the trend is pretty flat. There are some fluctuation, but overall, it's a very steady flows. And for New Zealand, it's slightly different. It was quite steady flows from the financial year of 2013-14 to 2020-21. But then there is a spike in the next 3 financial years. And that happens because of because New Zealand introduced the new resident visa that provides extra pathway for people to get residency in 2021. But then the effect for that visa is temporary, as the visa was closed in July 2022. Still, it made a huge impact, but then this effect will probably not continue. So how about the temporary migrants? Let's start with something simple in the US. For Fijians going to United States on temporary basis, the number of temporary visas issued, we can see it is pretty flat in terms of the overall trend, even though there are a lot of monthly fluctuations. But overall, we can see that there is no big change in terms of Fiji's immigration pace to the US. And moving on to New Zealand, this graph shows the stock of Fijian temporary migrants in New Zealand, and we kind of exclude the visitor from this graph. So here we see that the majority of Fijian temporary migrants in New Zealand are non-seasonal workers. And then they have been experiencing a steady increase in numbers. And also the second largest group is the students. And for those students, 90% of them are the dependents of the workers. So the patterns for the students and workers are quite similar over the years. It is very important to note that because of this large stock of workers and students, these people, they actually have the means to immigrate like permanently. And then as we see in the decline here, which is caused by the introduction of the new resident visa in 2021, and that kind of transformed a large stock of existing temporary workers and students into more permanent positions. And seeing from that, we can see that the existing temporary migrants in New Zealand, they do have a very strong desire to migrate when the opportunity arises. And furthermore, we see there is a new peak in 2023. So even though we have transformed a lot of temporary migrants into permanent migrants, but then there is a significant influx of new workers from Fiji to New Zealand, and that result in the peak in 2023. Then in Australia, over the years, the growth in the stock of Fijian temporary migrants in Australia is much higher. And there are many flight groups. Basically, the expansion of the Pacific Labour Mobility Scheme has resulted in the surge we see in 2022 and 2023. But then most of, I think, supposedly all of these people will have to return to their country ultimately. But then there is also like a growing number of other type of workers and students that's really driving up the stock numbers. And similar to the case of New Zealand, many people here, they still have this like strong willingness to emigrate permanently when they can. And also there is a unique group of bridging visa holders. So bridging visas are issued to people who are applying for other visas and they are waiting for other visas to be processed. In Australia, for the Fiji temporary migrants, there is a very big group of people applying for asylum visas. And because the processing time of this visa is very lengthy, so we do see a big stock of people holding bridging visas. We can expand a little bit more on this group. So basically, we see this is the graph showing the onshore protection visa applied and granted by to Fijians. Overall, we see the blue line, which is the visa application, the number of visa applications. It declines in the beginning of 2020s. To less than 20 by August 2020, and then it started to increase again, but in a very gradual pace. So despite the variations in the visa application numbers, the visa actually granted to the Fijians who will be able to stay in Australia for much longer periods. This number is actually pretty low, and has been consistently low. So there is actually not many people who actually become the who can actually gain permanent residency through this pathway. Therefore, most of the people who are waiting in the line, they will have to return to their country at the end of the day. However, because this whole process, this whole decision-making process is so lengthy, so a lot of people do use this way to prolong their stay in Australia. So one of the worries is that whether we see a building up of people waiting in the system as this is what likely happened before 2020. But then if we see the number of visa determined over the time, the pattern of it is actually quite similar to the number of visa applied. So actually there is not a change in the number of people waiting in the system for this visa. Another group we look at is the student visa holders. And basically the surge in Fijian students in Australia is really driven by the student who come to study in the vocational education and training sector, which is BET sector. And as Australia is really tightening its policies on students, giving a lot of requirements on, for example, English requirements and proposed student cap on international students. This can reduce the number of students, and we already see that in the patterns for the VET sector for Fijian students. However, it is still important to point out that as compared to the students in VET sector for people from all countries, the increase for the Fijian students is actually quite persistent. To wrap up, the immigration boom has primarily been driven by temporary migration to Australia and New Zealand. However, that doesn't really mean the boom in Fiji immigration is temporary, as we see that the tightening immigration policies in Australia and New Zealand are very effective and can have a huge impact on the future trends of Fiji immigration. But then it is also important to know that there are very important factors that could possibly sustain the high level of immigration. And the first one is that a significant number of existing Fijian students and workers are in Australia and New Zealand, and they may seek permanent migration options in the future when they can. And then there are initiatives in Australia and New Zealand that have been introduced to bring up the Pacific representation, and says migration is increasingly recognized as an economic strategy and for people to pursue better life. And lastly, as mentioned in Michael's presentation, like it's very similar to the Micronesian migrants, that existing Fijian communities in other countries that can also facilitate the way for further immigration. So I think.
We have 10 minutes before lunch, so maybe we'll take one golden question. I don't want to go through from your lunch, so maybe one question before we go for lunch.
Thanks, I'm John Connell from Sydney University. I'm doing some work with the WHO Collaboration Centre at UTS on migration of Fijian nurses, which just happens to be quite a nice footnote to what Sharon was talking about earlier. If you look at the Fijian workforce, 40% of all nursing positions are unfilled in Fiji. That means a lot of gaps. That means that not only migration is responsible for that, but because it's going on with financing and so on, but there's very significant migration of Fijian nurses overseas. Last year, 2023, 200 Fijian nurses were registered in New Zealand. What we don't know, unfortunately, too much is what is happening here. What has happened to nursing migration here, and what mechanisms are coming in and so on. But you can imagine the impact that is happening in Fiji. Some health centres are closing, big health centres are closing, significant loss of expertise, not just in the formal nursing skills, but in management and mentoring and so on and so forth. So there's a whole lot of the Fijian health sector. So it's an ongoing project which is really interesting. We're really desperate to get some good data on what is happening in Australia to Fijian nurses that come here. The idea behind the whole thing, of course, is to see if there are mechanisms for slowing migration, which is going to be very difficult in an age of cultural migration. And secondly, to also encourage some people, perhaps for various reasons, to return to Fiji, bring back skills that they've intensified in New Zealand, Australia, or elsewhere, and boost a desperately weakened health sector.
So, someone.
Sharon, you talked about pull factors in terms of numbers that moved out of Fiji, and you seem to think that most people moving out of Fiji have done so for jobs. What about the push factors in terms of, I won't say political instability, but I'll say insecurity. 2022, I think you'd mentioned a spike in numbers that moved out. I think you would see a similar spike had you looked at data post 87 and every military coup that Fiji's had. And the other question is, I've forgotten my question. Oh my God, I've forgotten my question. I'm so pissed off about something. I've forgotten the question. Okay, I'll come back to you during the break. But I think that would factor in, and not necessarily only, the enticement of labor mobility and things like that. Because that election with Rambuka coming in 2022 would have factored in big time into those numbers moving out. And also, do you have a breakdown of ethnic groups in terms of when you say Fijians moving out? Do you have a breakdown in terms of Indo-Fijian numbers and Itoke numbers who've moved out of Fiji to Australia and New Zealand? Because that would also be quite telling in terms of the security that I mentioned and the push factor in those particular years.
It's really good to see a lot of Fijians agreeing to this issue because it's quite controversial. And we actually have a second answer. So if Stephen wants to throw in some something that would be very helpful. Because it's really a very preliminary analysis on this huge topic. And as it mentioned in the morning, like we are really sorry to say that, but we are really pointing at raising up the questions instead of really proposing a solution. But I definitely agree that there are much scope to analyze. And then like historically, the military coup was a big factor really driving out people to immigrate, especially for the Indo-Fijian group. But then I think for this analysis, why we think it's pretty important is really for people to understand, like we do talk a lot about labor mobility, how labor mobility is really attracting people out of Fiji and in the rest of the Pacific. But also there is a very, very, very big group that is immigrating using the skill string, and especially for Fijians, they are very skilled, competent. And then people, when they have the capability, when they have the strong will because of military group, because of socioeconomic factors, and they were just try to immigrate. Like the tightening policy in Australia and New Zealand, they can have some impact. But then in the long term, people will still want to migrate and seek for better opportunity. And this is something that we want to emphasize. And I think it's just like pointing on the direction to solve this question into something that is even bigger, like how to really reduce this huge gap in terms of the living standards between Australia and the Pacific.
Are you able to differentiate in those years where there have been spikes? How many came in as unskilled, low skilled, no skilled workers for the labor mobility job? And what percentages came in who were, part of the brain drain, the educated, skilled graduates who moved to Australia? And I think because of the insecurity issues.
I'm your colleague, so I just recently moved into labor mobility. Not the right person for you to ask. So many good colleagues.
Maybe you can help as well anecdotally. I think just with conversations that I've had with I think whether you Itoke or whether you Indo-Fijian, I think young people that are coming out of university that have qualified, that have degrees, I guess bulk majority of them are looking for some sort of opportunity overseas. I would say that's sort of fair across the board. I take that point that there is, you will see spikes in 2022. I think that would have been driven, I agree with that, that would have been driven by uncertainty around the I guess, the security of, Indo-Fijians, after, like having Rabuka come back into government. And you would have seen similar spikes, after 2006, you would have seen a high spike in people making asylum seeking, applications. So that would have been more Itoke, I guess, more than Indo-Fijians, but you know, that's something that is, peculiar to Fiji in that sense.
I just wanted to make, Sadna gave us actually a really nice, I mean, you're going to close us off, but a really nice point to end on, because we sort of opened up with this comment about the economic framework and the decision making. And you gave us a really beautiful example there I just wanted to point out. When we think about the microeconomics of migration and the decision to move at the individual level, it's not just the wage differences and the earnings premiums. When you're evaluating your welfare decision to move and that objective function to option, they're exactly the type of things that you're bringing into that decision as well, that you can't place a dollar value on when you're leaving. And taking that type of a framework is very powerful in doing that. And just like when you come here, you're not only placing on it your earnings, you're placing on it how you're treated, the community, all of these other things that enter into a welfare function. So thank you for raising that nice example, because the politics of stuff is very, very important in thinking about these push factors and pull factors. But then people ultimately voting with their feet on the net of all of that as it washes out. So thank you, Sadna, for a nice example.
Professor House is last. No, okay. Well,
Last question, sorry, I know you wanted a very simple question. When the refugee visa was applied for, the refugee visa you mentioned, and is it possible from a data collection purpose, you can, why they applied for the refugee visa? Can you collect that data? Like you have 10,000 people, the different visa, different reasons to apply for refugee visa. Is it possible to get that data?
So that's highly personal data, kind of getting to why someone's applying for a refugee.
So you only know it's from the 86 visa, this is from the PUV visa. You only know the category of visa. You don't really know the reason why they come to Australia for refugee visa reason. Thank you.
Can you tell the previous visa help?
Before they apply for the refugee visa, this data is not available from public websites. But then I think like for Home Affairs, they're definitely tracking that. And they might generate some reports at a higher level, but then it's kind of something that they don't quite review. And for a lot of countries, because it's just very, very single numbers, it would be very risky to review that.
colleagues, can we show our appreciation for our